Welcome back to A Slice of News, where I cut you off a slice of news. The Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, or SAVE Act, has passed in the Republican-controlled House and is now set to be voted on by the Senate. Despite its ultra-patriotic name, the SAVE Act is little more than a voter suppression bill. If this bill were to pass the Senate and become a law, it would require people registering to vote to show proof of citizenship in the form of a passport or a birth certificate, which doesn't sound like a huge ask on its face until you take into account that according to a study conducted by voting rights groups, almost 21 million Americans do not have easy access to citizenship documents, which means that they would be unable to register to vote under this new proposed law, despite the fact they're absolutely U.S. citizens and should be therefore eligible to register to vote, but are unable to simply because they do not have the required documents to prove it. Which kind of makes sense. Most people don't walk around with their proof of citizenship at all times because you don't have to go around proving you're a citizen most of the time. Were the SAVE Act to become a law, it would require you to use your passport to prove citizenship. Well, 146 million people don't have a passport. It would also require you to show your birth certificate. Assuming you even know where your birth certificate is, 69 million women, some of which probably do know where their birth certificate is, don't have a name that matches the one on that document because they took their husband's name when they got married. So since their legal name and their birth name now no longer match, they would become ineligible from registering to vote. A century after women got the right to vote in this country, the SAVE Act would be taking that right away from millions of them. And you really have to wonder if that's by design. Female voters have often skewed towards the left and voted Democrat in many of the recent elections, so there's a good chance that they're trying to make sure that that doesn't happen. Just the requirement of using a passport as the proof of both identity and citizenship isn't really fair for a lot of people because they've never needed a passport. And the fee to get a new one is $160, money that many people simply do not have to spend on something just to allow them to exercise their constitutional right to vote. And why would they need it? They've never traveled outside the country. They'd have no need to ever travel outside the country. A passport is something that they've never needed, and now they are required to have. As the name suggests, the SAVE Act is being billed as a way of saving the country, saving them from what? Non-citizens voting, when the reality is that non-citizens voting has never been a real issue, and the Republicans pushing this bill to become a law know that. But also know that pushing this false narrative that non-citizens are voting and that you need some sort of protection against it is something that can really resonate with their voting base. If they keep their people scared, they can get away with anything. The reality is the SAVE Act isn't protecting anyone. All it is doing is preventing eligible U.S. citizens from being able to register to exercise their right to vote. Because the regime is afraid, and probably rightfully so, that if a lot of people are able to register to vote, they're going to be voted out. So I guess the SAVE Act is really more of the Save Ourselves Act. But if they were honest about it in that way, they probably couldn't have sold it to their constituents quite as easily. And this is just one more example of Republicans wrapping something that would be generally unpopular in a patriotic shell so that people will just say, oh wow, it's so great for America, without actually taking into account what the bill actually does when put into practice. Who can forget the Patriot Act that basically ushered in an era of government surveillance on its own people, but it was okay because it had the word patriot in it. Bill would also require photo ID to vote, which its supporters defend by saying, well, you have to use a photo ID to buy alcohol or spray paint at the hardware store. Why is this such a big deal? Ignoring the fact that buying spray paint or alcohol is not a constitutionally protected right. Over 20 million Americans don't have a valid driver's license or similar photo ID. So all those millions of Americans would just not be able to vote, even though they have the right to do so, as every citizen of this country over the age of 18 does. And acquiring one is, again, an additional cost that each of them has to endure simply to cast their ballot, which many have rightfully called a modern poll tax. They can't literally make us pay to cast our vote, but under the provisions set out in this bill, They would effectively be doing exactly that for millions of Americans. According to an audit in Georgia last year, only 20 suspected non-citizens out of 8.2 million registered voters were discovered. And in North Carolina, only 9 out of their 7.7 million registered voters were found to be potentially non-citizens. Trying to push this bill on the promise of protecting election integrity from the scourge of the non-citizen voter is simply disingenuous at best, and really it's just an outright lie. But it's part of their continuing narrative that Democrats only win because they have non-citizens voting for them. And if it weren't for the non-citizens, they wouldn't win elections. When of course that's complete nonsense. As I showed here, not only are Democrats not winning because of illegal votes, there really are no illegal votes. Non-citizens do not vote Democrat because non-citizens do not vote. But Republicans continue to use that as a smokescreen to hide their obvious voter suppression bill as something other than what it is. We actually have an idea of what the SAVE Act made law would look like. In 2011, Kansas passed a proof of citizenship law, and it kept 31,000 people, which came out to 1 out of every 7 applicants for voter registration. So you scale that up to a national level, you can only imagine the huge number of eligible U.S. citizens who are going to be completely shut out from the electoral process, simply because they can't present the right document that the government says you need to now, simply to exercise your rights. It's also important to note that that 2011 law in Kansas was struck down in 2018 because the judge determined that it violated the 1993 National Voter Registration Act and the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. The SAVE Act is a voter disenfranchisement bill. It is a voter suppression bill, and trying to call it anything other than what it is just avoiding the truth. The only thing the SAVE Act is aiming to save is Republicans from getting an absolute annihilation in the upcoming midterm elections and other subsequent elections. Without question, the SAVE Act is a terrible bill that is designed to keep as many citizens as possible from being able to register and exercise their right to vote. It should never have gotten through the House, it shouldn't pass the Senate, and it certainly shouldn't be signed into a law. It would in effect be legalizing voter suppression and be denying tens of millions of U.S. citizens one of their fundamental constitutional rights. It is seeking to limit the voice of historically marginalized groups like women and people of color. Making it harder to vote is just bad for democracy as a whole. There simply is no legitimate justification for trying to push something like this into law, other than, I suppose, coming out and just saying, we don't want certain sections of the population being able to vote, or at least making it much harder for them to do so. So we're going to make this law to make sure that they can't. That would be awful, but it also would be honest. All that said, I will note with a bit of amusement that in their fervor to cut off Democrat votes, Republicans who'd made this bill didn't consider who else they were cutting off with their potential voter suppression law. A lot of Republican voters and potential voters have never left their state, let alone the country. They would have no need to have a passport. So now making that a requirement to register to vote could potentially make it so that they are unable. Conservatives love to push how they're focused on the family and about the sanctity of marriage. Well, a lot of those Republican women changed their name when they got married, so they're not going to have a matching birth certificate, ensuring that they will struggle to be able to register to vote. By comparison, many Democratic voters have traveled outside the country and do possess a valid passport, and many of them who got married kept their maiden name so that their birth certificate and current ID do match. So if this bill does pass the Senate and does get signed into law, they may have just cost themselves a huge amount of Republican voters right before a midterm where they need every single Republican vote they can get, because there is a solid chance that they are going to lose bigly to the Democrats. So does passing the SAVE Act potentially hoist Republicans by their own petard and end up being more damaging to them than to the opposition they were enacting it to fight? Possibly. Would seeing that happen amuse me greatly? Definitely. But even with that potential to blow up in their face, the SAVE Act is still an anti-democratic bill that is aimed to disenfranchise and restrict the rights of American citizens. And it doesn't matter which side of the political aisle you fall, no one should have their constitutional right to vote taken away from them by the government in the name of protecting election integrity from largely mythical non-citizen voters. The only solace in this regard is that when it gets to the Senate, they almost definitely do not have the votes to pass it. Senate Majority Leader John Thune said he doesn't think they have the 60 votes necessary to pass it, and I think he's right. It will likely die in the Senate. In the admittedly unlikely event that it did get past the Senate and onto the president's desk, it would become one of the worst voter suppression laws in American history. While conservatives are always up in arms about how the right to bear arms should never be infringed, the right to vote is what they should really be more concerned about not having the government infringe upon, because the SAVE Act does exactly that. And while insufficient votes in the Senate may save the American people from the SAVE Act, they will try again. This is not where it ends. This is only one attempt at pushing massive voter suppression and disenfranchisement, because that is ultimately their end goal, no matter how wrapped in a flag they may try to present it. And the American people cannot stand idly by while one of their most fundamental and vital rights is slowly chipped away and taken from them. Alright guys, that'll be it for this episode of A Slice of News. I've been your host, Mr. Slice, and until next time, when I cut you off another slice of news. And don't forget to rate and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you find it.